During the Civil War, we had veterans from both sides that had experienced the war, the horrors of the war, the death, the destruction. Given what we had in those days, we didn't have psychiatric medicine, we didn't have psychology. They took all these symptoms and they decided to call it soldier's heart. During World War I, they decided to call it shell shock.
A very famous case of a shell shock victim is Wilfred Owen, who wrote a poem called Mental Cases, in which he looks at shell shock. He describes them with horrific detail. These minds of these men have been ravished by death, that they've witnessed murders, multitudinous murders. And in the case of Vietnam, if the soldiers come back and are not welcomed, a friend of mine put it this way. He said that soldiers from previous wars came home and were absolved of their sins by a grateful nation. The soldiers of Vietnam received no such absolution.
But it's actually interesting that the word PTSD didn't actually come in until the early 1980s. Now, the war in Vietnam had been over for 5 years, and we were still struggling with we were looking at these young men. What in the heck are we dealing with here?
Post-traumatic stress disorder, it became part of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders in 1980, and that kind of put PTSD in the field of traumatology on the map. It was the first time it was ever acknowledged and published, in a format that led credibility to the field.
That is a common concern among servicemen who have developed nervous conditions during their stay in the Army as to what the public is going to think about them. Undoubtedly, there will be people on the outside who won't have any understanding of the condition, who may think of it as being a rather shameful condition. If a civilian, the average civilian, were subjected to similar stresses, he undoubtedly would have developed the same type of nervous condition that most of you fellows developed. All of us have our so-called breaking point.
Now that was a mashup of clips we pulled together from our first documentary that released back in 2014, Invisible Scars, that takes on the topic of post-traumatic stress disorder. I placed it here really on the tail of episode 5 just to help you maybe remember what post-traumatic stress disorder is, because in this episode we're going to take on a different soul wound known as moral injury. Now, moral injury occurs when your conscience is violated. Post-traumatic stress occurs when something outside of you occurs that kind of sets you on high alert. Post-traumatic stress is a response to an external event. Moral injury is a response to something internal with the conscience. Now, I'm not going to belabor it and continue talking about it because we'll define it really in the screen share here from Disentangled. Now, if you don't have it yet, I'll put a link down in the show notes. Disentangled is the 6th lesson Bible study about warriors, hope, and faith. It's going to talk about who a warrior is. It's going to use the metaphor of Paul in talking to Timothy about no soldier in active service entangling themselves in the affairs of everyday life, but seeking to please the one who enlisted him. Paul uses that metaphor. After spending so much time with soldiers, he uses that metaphor as a parallel to the Christian life. And so that's really what we do here, talking about entangling yourself in the military mission, disentangling to come home, but when you disentangle, re-entangling into a new mission that helps live out the purpose to which you're called. Moral injury is one of the key issues that is a hurdle that many people need to overcome in terms of walking out that next mission. And you might think about it like this. It's hard to walk into your purpose when you're clinging to pains of the past, intentionally or unintentionally. But once you start resolving those pains, then you're more readily to live fully present and to move forward. It's just so hard to do that when you're anchored into the past. And moral injury is one of the biggest anchors that holds people back. So here's what you're going to hear today or see. The screen share from the first part of chapter 4, lesson 4 in Disentangled, where we're dialoguing about what is moral injury, where does it come from, how do you start moving forward through it, and then on the tail end of it, I'm going to play you some of the clips from Songs of Hope #2, where singer-songwriter Alexis Wilkins was matched with a group of kids, a family who lost their father to suicide. Now, currently, we lose 22 soldiers per day to suicide. That's not a new statistic. It's been going on for a while. Statistically, since 9/11, our American soldiers are more likely to die at their own hands than at the hands of an enemy combatant. And while many people say that that's probably a result of post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I'm not a licensed counselor, don't have the credentials as a psychologist or psychiatrist. Simply by observing and walking through this and writing content and interviewing veterans and with the team at Crosswinds for several years, my opinion is that most of what we see in terms of suicide and a lot more of what we see in terms of just the angst and the emotional toll that people carry has to do with moral injury and not post-traumatic stress. We'll talk about a little bit of it and why in this episode. And just as you look forward, next episode, we'll talk about how do you find healing from moral injury.
Second soul wound that we're going to discuss, which is moral injury. Now, this one is very different than PTSD. It is most often confused with PTSD. However, as we go through this, you'll see that two things I want you to highlight. Number one is, I believe this one is more prevalent than post-traumatic stress. And number two, this one, I really believe is far more accessible in terms of healing for a reason that we'll outline. Now, opening up the chapter, if you go to your book on page 91, this is a verse from David after we alluded to this much earlier, back in lesson 1, the sin with Bathsheba when he effectively impregnates Uriah, one of his mighty men, one of his warriors, one of his elite warriors. That would be like in our world, like at an elite special forces, a SEAL team, one of the mighty men. He impregnates that man's wife while he's at battle, calls the man back to try to urge the man to sleep with his wife. The man will not, because the oath he's taken. He's allegiant to his commanding officer, Joab, and the other warriors who are now fighting. He says it wouldn't be fair for him to sleep with his wife and go into his own home. So he sleeps outside on the porch because they're all living outside. And so David has to cover this up, eventually sends Uriah back to the commanding officer, Joab, with his death warrant and says, hey, make it look like Joab got slain in battle, but set it up. So he sets it up, and when the enemy encroaches, they all abandon Joab, and he gets slaughtered. David eventually repents of that. We're going to talk about that process in this chapter. And this is the verse that he leads off with. For I know my transgressions and my sin is ever before me. I have sinned and done what is evil in your sight. Often, warriors feel some version of this. It's not just an external threat that's out there, mortar fire, bombs, gunfire, an enemy. It's something inside of you. Questions like, should I even been there? Questions like, I did that thing, and even if I did something, pulled the trigger for a good reason to save life, I still pulled the trigger. In this lesson, we're going to talk about guilt and shame. And again, the technical term here is moral injury. That is the title of the chapter. It is the term used by experts. It's often mistaken for PTSD, but we're going to look at the differences in this chapter. Many times, let me highlight this, many times people feel guilt or shame for the wrong they've done or for the good they failed to do, as in James 4:17. James says, to the one who knows to do good and does not do it, it is sin. So they feel guilty over some good that they should have done. Other times, we might feel guilty over, it could be a misplaced guilt or shame. Let's say it that way, because of things done to us, or could be the result of a circumstance over which we had no control, but we still feel it's my fault. Now, the goal in all of this lesson is not to get to the determination of why people feel the way they feel. It's the fact that, hey, we feel it. Like there's some angst inside of us. So the goal is going to be to find healing. We don't have to dissect all the minutiae and get to it in order to find healing. We can acknowledge it and then move forward in freedom. Now, let me say this before we go forward. Difference. And I'll repeat it a few times. When warriors do things that violate their conscience, their sense of right and wrong, moral injury is the result, or could be the result. Let's say that could be. It often results. PTSD is a perceived threat to external circumstances outside of you. That's why it takes the form of fight or flight. If it's outside of me, I can fight against it, or I can take flight and run away from it. Moral injury is not external, it's internal. And wherever you go, there you are. So it's just going with you all. You can't fight or flight that. It's in you, and it's expressed as guilt or shame. Dr. Rita Brock is an expert, a leading authority on moral injury. And she says this is in our book, or in our film, Honoring the Code. This is a quote that's on the top of the lead page of the chapter, page 93. She says this: moral injury results when soldiers violate their core moral beliefs, and in evaluating their behavior negatively, they feel they no longer live in a reliable, meaningful world and can no longer be regarded as decent human beings. They may feel this even if what they did was warranted and unavoidable. The consequences of violating one's conscience, even if the act was unavoidable or seemed right at the time, can be devastating. Now, moral injury is this. These are bullet points that you have on that same page right there, just under a quote, page 93. Moral injury is the result of being involved in something that violates your code, your moral compass, your conscience. It causes a sense of unworthiness or a sense of guilt and shame, and it can occur even if the event that caused it was justifiable, or if it was not the fault of the morally injured person. Now let's maybe put another layer on this. Here's what the conscience is. Webster's dictionary says the conscience is the sense or consciousness, the awareness of the moral goodness or blameworthiness of one's own conduct, of one's intentions or character, together with a right feeling of obligation to do right or to be good. That's the top of page 94 in your book. So it is this drive that we feel like we should do the right thing. Now, Paul, strangely enough, addresses this in Romans 14:5-6. And what he highlights here is the conscience is unique to each of us, which that definition, we'll come back to it in a moment, it said. Paul says this: one person regards one day above another, another regards every day alike. What he's referring to right there specifically in this context is some people say, hey, you shouldn't work on the Sabbath rules and regulations. Other people say, hey, it doesn't matter. Other people would have thought, hey, special holy holidays should be observed. And Paul says, well, hey, that's a matter of conscience. Continue reading. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. Now, what he's saying right there is all throughout the Old Testament, they had all these dietary restrictions. And so some people thought, well, you could eat this food, you could eat that food, you can't eat this, you can't eat that. We still do that today. We still, different people think certain food and drinks off limits, certain food and drinks. So, okay, Paul says it's a matter of conscience. Notice, does so for the Lord. Now I'm on the second to the top, second from the bottom. For he gives thanks to God. And he who eats not or who abstains from those food, drink, for the Lord he does not eat, and he gives thanks to God. In this verse, Paul shows that when left to our own, you and I, we perceive right and wrong differently. Yeah, for sure. You and I, let's just talk one-to-one, me to you. We might agree on some of the big issues as right and wrong, but the conscience, when we get down to some of these things, it's unique to each of us. Now, this doesn't mean our conscience is always right. It just means that it's there. And what we would encourage you to do is to pursue the scripture. Let that be the final arbiter. Now, again, let's go back to the definition. Conscience is the sense or consciousness of the moral goodness or blameworthiness of one's own conduct, intentions, or character with the feeling of obligation to do right or to be good. The conscience, again, is unique to each of us. So that leads a question here. There's space in your book on page 95 to write the answer here. Just what is your moral compass based on? Where did you get your own values? You know, our conscience, our convictions, they're influenced by many people. They're influenced by many things. What we want to drive at is your conscience needs an accurate basis. It needs to be based on truth. And I know people go, well, my conscience is based on the Bible. Well, here's the deal. Paul's saying, hey, like according to the Bible, even people see some things differently. But you've got to have a true north. You've got to have something that is a standard. It might be based on whether people taught you. It might be based on a parent. It might be based on values you learned. Maybe as a warrior, it might be based on religious conviction. But you've got to have that. And let me ask you another question here. What would be the result if your conscience is based on something that's not true? For instance, what if you were raised in a legalistic family, or what if you were raised in a house where anything goes with no rules? You know, that might create confusion later on. These are all questions we want to think through. Now, in David's situation, he had a conscience that early on in his life, Saul was trying to kill him. After David slaughtered Goliath, Saul made some errors. The kingdom was going to be torn from Saul's hands. His sons were not going to inherit the kingdom. And he knew that David was the next in line. And he became very jealous and angry of David and tried to kill him. Now, there was an instance where David, on running for his life, he hid in a cave from Saul. And Saul went in there to use the restroom in the cave to relieve himself. And he was literally inches away from him. And David could have killed him right then. There was another instance where he fell into a deep sleep, and David went into the camp where Saul was sleeping, and everybody was in a deep sleep. He snuck right up to him, and he could have killed him. In this instance, he cut off the corner of Saul's robe just to show him while he was in the cave that he could have taken his life and did not. Now, David's men, according to their conscience, interpreted this one way. David's men interpreted this instance as, hey, we're hiding in a cave, we're running for our life, and your enemy that has come in here, the guy pursuing your life has come into this cave to use the restroom and relieve himself, and you're able to kill him right now. They are in effect saying, God has given your enemy into your hands. Kill him now and stop running for your life. David's conscience wouldn't allow him to kill Saul, so he cut a corner of the robe instead to show Saul that he could have killed him. And then after he cut the robe, here's what he says. It came about afterward that David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. Now some Bible translators say, well, what he did was he cut off the tassels of Saul's garment, like the prayer shawl that all Jewish men would have worn. And so he's like kind of cutting it off, like making kind of, you cut the prayer shawl, you cut his connection to his heavenly Father. Maybe. Whatever the case, though, cutting a robe, very different than killing someone. His men's conscience had no problem with David killing Saul. They encouraged it, but David's conscience, it affected him even just cutting that robe. It might be like some of us, we're cool driving 5 to 10 miles per hour over the speed limit. But some of us are like, no, you don't go an iota over the speed limit. You stay. Some of us might drink alcohol. Some of us might not. Some of us might eat certain foods. Some of us might not. David's conscience even bothered him for cutting the edge of this robe. So he said to his men, far be it from me because of the Lord that I should do this thing to my Lord. The Lord's anointed to stretch out my hand against him. Even stretching out my hand to cut his robe because he is the Lord's anointed. David persuaded his men with these words, and he did not allow them to rise up against Saul. He wouldn't even let them take action against him. Here's how the conscience works. If you know to do right, but you don't do right, the result may be a guilty conscience. Second point on the screen, if you do what's right, the result should be a clear conscience. Third point, if you do something that affects your conscience, that offends your conscience, you need to own it and correct it as quickly as possible. Or if you did something and then even years later, it comes up like, oh, I can't believe I did that. Oh my goodness. Oh, wow. As soon as you know about it or find out about it or hits you, you correct it. You deal with the guilt, you deal with the shame, whether it's real or perceived, deal with it quickly. And we've got to learn a basis there for dealing with it. More about moral injury from Dr. Rita Brock. She says this: moral injury can lead veterans to feelings of worthlessness, remorse, and despair. They may feel as if they lost their souls in combat and are no longer who they were. Connecting emotionally to others becomes impossible for those trapped inside the walls of such feelings. When the consequences become overwhelming, the only relief may seem to be to leave this life behind. Here's, again, just our opinion is more people who take their life related to military service, probably related to PTSD, not PTSD, moral injury. When it's PTSD, you can medicate it. When it's PTSD, you can take fight against it. You can fight from it. You can be hyper vigilant. You can all the things. But when it's moral injury, it's guilt or shame. It becomes this overwhelming, gnawing remorse inside. In the book on page 99, you find this illustration. And again, this just highlights the differences there between PTSD, between moral injury. PTSD, again, fight or flight, external, outside of you. Moral injury on the right there, it's a feeling, and you just keep thinking about it. You keep ruminating on it, guilt or shame to internal threats. Lots of discussion about, well, is PTSD emotional or is it mental, or moral injury? What is it? Mental, emotional? What is that? The main difference I want to highlight right here to you is that these are both soul wounds. However, moral injury carries this spiritual element to it. Regardless of your faith background, it is this, I believe, the image of God imprinted on us as the conscience definition that we said, with this propensity to want to do right, to want to be upstanding, to want to add value to the world around us, to want to be in a good position morally, ethically. And that, again, carries that spiritual element to it.
The issue with so much of this is that
when you get into this, you start realizing that moral injury and PTSD do have some similarities. And so moral injury and PTSD, sometimes they are misdiagnosed. Or to be more accurate about it, moral injury is often misdiagnosed as PTSD. Whether it's undiagnosed, though, or misdiagnosed, it creates a serious problem for the warrior. If it's undiagnosed, it means treatment that's needed will not be received. You just won't get it. If it's misdiagnosed as PTSD, it means the treatment that's given will be ineffective. You're trying to treat the wrong thing. So as moral injury and PTSD are not the same, their treatments are not the same. Again, whereas PTSD creates a fight or flight response, moral injury typically manifests as overwhelming feelings of guilt or shame. Whereas PTSD may require medication in addition to other kinds of therapies, moral injury must be dealt with very differently, in a different manner. Whereas PTSD is primarily addressed as being mental and emotional, moral injury, even though it has an emotional component, it's basically moral. It is spiritual. There's the difference. Dr. Lou Ann Bourne quoted it in our film, Honoring the Code. She says this: I think when moral injury occurs with a veteran, they are desperate for the pain to stop, and they're angry. They're so angry at what has occurred, then the anger plus the pain and the hopelessness and the helplessness at changing the event propels them into ideas of suicide. Another quote, this is Jim Reinhardt. He was a Marine. He affirmed that he had moral injury. He said, it affected me greatly. I stopped going to church. I've yet to return to church. He's in our film, Honoring the Code. I don't think I'm worthy, and I want to go back to church, but I don't think I'm worthy enough. Now, in this, what's interesting is Reinhardt's conscience separated him from really, in that moment, being at the place where he felt he could find God. Now, some people might say, well, you can find God anywhere, but his moral compass and the conscience is different for each of us, and the conscience can be based on things that aren't accurate. His moral compass, again, whether right or wrong, it told him God is found at the church. So, you think about what would you say to Reinhardt? How would you help him move forward? Colonel John Reitzel, he says this: the mortality of war, the morality of war is always in question. The first time I actually had a human being in a peep sight, I blinked and I thought to myself, every day of my life, I have been taught, thou shalt not kill, and I'm about to end this guy's life. It's the first time. And I pulled the trigger, and I can tell you this, it gets easier and easier as you do it more and more, and the more you do it, the easier it gets, the worse you feel. There's always a black hole right here.
I see like people talking about how their dads are just annoying and they won't leave them alone and stuff. I'm like, well, I mean, you have one. I mean, I would love to have one, you know. That'd be great, but...
upset and stuff that he's not here. And I just, it's just hard, really, just to, I mean, everything is, but sometimes I just get mad. I shouldn't, I just get mad.
The hardest part, well, I guess would just be losing someone that you love. It's super hard. It's something that you sometimes can't get over. And
Really, because he left my mom with this much stuff, and she tells me I look just like him and stuff. So it's hard just to be like, you know, all I have is pictures and stuff.
I just want to get my mom in that song.
Don't you worry. She's gonna get the whole second verse.
Okay.
That's her verse. I get it. Yeah, we have to get that second verse to him.
You know, you just lost, like, you know, love of your life, and then you have 3 kids to take care of by
She
yourself.
was like dealing with that, and also like had to be strong for y'all.
Yeah.
She hid all the bad, showed us all the good we had, like all the
Yes.
like chink. Okay.
Give a high five. Give me a high five.
Thank you. Sometimes I'm in my head replaying what you said, or sometimes I'm in my
My mom will know what it means by replaying all the things that he said because of tape. I won't
It's
remember.
true. Held our hands when it got hard, and I know it was too much, but you taught us to be tough, and sometimes it's still too much. We had the last line definitely being some things you can never change. In its face, like we had some things you can never change, and
It happened, you know.
yeah, time doesn't really make it
Yeah.
Change what happened.
easier. Yeah,
It all time really doesn't it?
you
Yeah.
can draw it out a little bit.
Yeah.
Time doesn't make it any easier.
I like that.
I make good points with some math when it comes to making songs like,
No, you're great. Time doesn't make it any easier, but it always can.
I like in the end coming back to that.
I like the whole song. She's gonna be a legend.
Oh my gosh.
She's really gonna be a legend.
Stop. Thank you.
Like, she's gonna be a bigger legend than Beyonce.
I don't know about that.
I don't know. I mean, well, actually, maybe. You never know.
Well, yeah. Walked in the club, just woke up. Sorry. Don't cut this part out, please.
This is off the record. I don't think we titled it, did we? We're calling it Pictures?
I think that would be
Yeah.
a great title.
All right, so the title of this song is?
Pictures.
Pictures.